Thank you all so much for joining us tonight via Zoom. Um, Sorry for the switcheroos, but we're glad we could still have this presentation tonight. I see some very familiar faces, and I see some new names on our Zoom here. So I'm Elva. I work for the Klamath Bird Observatory. I'm their Science Communications Outreach and Conservation Partnerships Manager. So I'm the one that you email when you're having a hard time with registration or have any questions about our events and things. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Ryan Terrill. He's our science director at KBO, and him and I are the ones leading the Bear Divide trip, and he's going to be talking to us about Bear Divide.
Thank you so much, Alva. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I appreciate the patience in pushing this back. I was quite sick last week, and as you can probably hear in my voice, I'm still getting over it. So I apologize if I have to stop and cough or sneeze or something. I'll try to remember to mute myself, and hopefully all of you can hear me okay. I'm using my headphones, and so that should help a little bit. My voice is not normally this husky. So thanks for your patience. Oh, I have to share the slides with you. I just full screen my slides for myself. That won't do any good. How's that look?
Good.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Cool. So Bear Divide. Bear Divide is this cool spot for bird migration in Southern California, down near Los Angeles. It is a super special spot. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to show a video really quickly. It's really hard to see what's going on in this video. So if you can't see much, don't get frustrated. This is a video I took of active migration at Bear Divide with birds flying by. And so what you're going to see is tiny little dots going from left to right in your screen. And as the video goes on, there's some closer ones. So, and also listen, you may be able to hear some calls of stuff going by. So there's a couple birds. Here come a couple more flying up that hillside and then right in front of the camera. Hope seeing some of that stuff. Here's a few more. Here's a few more. Look, especially at the bottom half of your screen. A couple more coming right up over the road. I know they're tough to see. But I took this, oh, there we go, right in front of the camera now. I took this with my iPhone because it's the only way to get zoomed out enough. But now you can see some birds coming right in front. So, I'm gonna let the video keep going. So what you're seeing is land birds, mostly warblers, things like yellow-rumped warblers and Townsend's and hermit warblers and yellow warblers, stuff like that, in active migration, migrating north in the spring. And what's pretty cool about that is that these types of birds, the small songbirds like the warblers and vireos and flycatchers and stuff like that, the birds we call passerines, they tend to migrate at night, and they tend to migrate high up in the atmosphere. We can see them on radar, and sometimes if we stand out on a really calm night, we can hear them flying overhead. And usually when we see them during the day, during migration, they're stopped at a stopover site. So we might see them at some, oh, somebody's got their, Elva, do you have the power to mute people? There we go, thanks. Oh. There we go. So you might see a bird stopping at a stopover site to refuel or something during the day. You might also see migration during the day. You might see some hawks or turkey vultures or something migrating during the day. But it's pretty weird to see passerines, warblers, flycatchers, tanagers, grosbeaks, stuff like that, migrating during the day, not only during the day, but down low near the ground where you can actually see them migrate. So what Bear Divide is a spot where you can watch passerine migration happen, which is really rare and really unique. And I'll get into it. It was first, as far as I know, brought to my attention and the attention of the general birding and ornithological public by this guy named Dan Maxwell, a friend of mine. He was there doing a morning briefing for some survey work, and they were sitting there doing their morning briefing, and all these birds were like flying by him, and he's like, "What the heck?" And so when I moved to LA to start my postdoc, he told me about it. This one time, this crazy thing happened, and I was like, "Man, maybe it's a maybe it's a cool spot, maybe it's a reliable spot," and started going up there. This other guy, John Garrett, who now works for eBird, also put in some of the early work finding this spot. Um, it is not just a place where you can see birds migrating, it's a place where you can see lots of birds migrating. So, this is my personal best day I've had there. I had over 14,000 individual birds. So, all those things you saw streaming by, we saw maybe 100 birds go by in that video. Imagine that times, 140. It's pretty amazing. It's this river of birds migrating by, like at your waist and knee level. It's a really phenomenal spot. We Bear Divide. So we've started going up there in 2019 and 2020. Started to get some attention, like here on the Birdcast forecast. They called it morning flight madness in Southern California this day that we had these 14,000 birds. Um, and yeah, it's a really cool spot. So I want to go back a little bit as to what's going on here. I told you that passerines tend to migrate at night and high up in the atmosphere. So what the heck? Why are we seeing them migrate low down and during the day? We have, pardon my sniffles, a bunch of major flyways throughout the world. We've got three major flyways in the US and a bunch in the old world. And there are a few known spots like this on some of the other flyways. So if you've ever been to New Jersey, there's a spot called Cape May where you can see a similar effect in the morning. You can go right out to the Cape and you can see birds, flying sort of in off the ocean in the morning. And there's a spot called Tatasaki Dunes on the St. Lawrence River. There's one or two known spots in Europe and at least one spot on the Central Flyway right on Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans by Slidell. And maybe and kind of one other spot in the West Coast, and I'll talk about that later. So very few spots like this. And before Bear Divide, maybe one other spot on the Pacific Flyway. So it's a unique thing that we mainly knew from the Atlantic, from both sides of the Atlantic, from the East Coast of the US and Europe, that we're finding seems to be happening here on our West Coast. We The idea from Cape May, this was published in 1992. Their guess was that birds overshot, so they would, be flying along the coast. Birds often follow the coast during migration, and then there's a point, and they'd shoot out onto the water. It would get light out, and they'd look around and be like, "Oh, the land's back there," and they'd turn around and come back to land. Well, that's obviously not what was happening at Bear Divide because they're flying over land, right? And some of the folks actually who published this paper are now less sure of that hypothesis. So that might be what's going on. That might be why these birds are doing this. Maybe at Cape May, maybe at some of the other spots. A lot of the other known spots for migration watching during the day are, on the coast, right on the edge of water. The only other spot for daytime passerine migration that we know of on the Pacific Flyway is this really cool spot named Butterette Spring. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. It's one of my favorite places in the world. My mom, who is on this call right now, started bringing me there when I was like 7 years old, and I've gone just about every year since then. And it concentrates migrants through what we think of as this sort of funnel effect. So you can see the spring is on this north-south canyon along this east-west mountain range. So you imagine as the birds are flying north, they hit this east-west mountain range and they might funnel into the canyon. And this is, really importantly, this is desert. So as the birds are flying high at night, basically all these passerines, wherever they are, they fly high at night and then it gets light out and they drop down and they find somewhere to feed for the day. Well, if they drop down and it's desert, there might not be anywhere to feed. So they might drop down and then just keep going. And we think of Butterette Springs, they might get funneled into this canyon, into this little spring. And Butterette Springs is, as far as I know, just about the only other spot on the Pacific Flyway where we can get these concentrations of birds like in active migration during the day. The Bear Divide is a pretty different setup, and it's kind of cool. Butterette Springs is, a good ways out in the desert. Bear Divide is right next to, one of the world's biggest metropolitan regions. It's just north of LA, right by Santa Clarita in the Angeles National Forest in the San Gabriel Mountains. Pardon me. Also been missing sleep because I've been keeping myself up coughing. So, um, so here's our guess at what's going on in Bear Divide. These are figures that I made for a paper that we published a couple years ago, presenting, Bear Divide to the scientific community. If you look all the way on the right at that big map with the red arrows, what I did is I filled in fog right at 820 meters, so you can see where the mountains are, where the high steep San Gabriel Mountains are, and where the lower LA Valley is. And so, those red arrows are hypothetical flight paths of birds moving north, and then they hit the San Gabriel Mountains. I don't know if you've ever been to LA and look up at the San Gabriels. They're actually like pretty big and steep. Instead of having to go up over the mountains, they hit and funnel along, funnel along, funnel along. And Bear Divide, where those brighter red arrows are, that's really the first narrow gap in the mountains. And so we think something similar is going on to Butterbret Springs, where birds are coming low, continuing north, and then getting funneled. It may be that they come down low and they're over the city. This is kind of sort of my guess. They come down low and they're over the city. It's a lot of buildings, it's a lot of concrete, it's a lot of pavement. And, it basically is a desert for them. There's quite a bit of trees and habitat and stuff in LA, but it may sort of act as a desert and they may just continue to push through the morning hours. That's kind of our current guess. So we have been doing work up at Bear Divide for the last few years. It was just me going up there out of curiosity because, Dan told me about this spot and I went up there the first day and with my wife and we had, a few birds and I went up a few more times that spring and we had a couple really good days, including that day I took that video. And then, momentum started going. I started going as much as I could and a few other people started coming up with me. And, we just had these really spectacular days that are really unique, just to be able to see this amount of migrants. A bush will have one of the first days I pulled up there, this Western tanager, I pulled up, there was a little tree and there were 14 Western tanagers all sitting in the tree, and, birds like Nashville and hermit warbler are pretty uncommon around the LA area. And you're lucky if you go birding in a day and see a handful, and you have to Bear Divide and see, 150 of them. So it was pretty cool. So we started to get momentum of people who are interested in coming up here. And we decided to start taking it seriously and start counting birds at Bear Divide. The most important thing we've learned is that the San Gabriel Mountains really appear to be an important corridor for land bird migration along the Pacific Flyway. And I don't think we really knew that. At least I didn't know that. If you think of Southern California and Los Angeles bird-wise, you might think of like, pardon me, rare birds show up every year. There's rarities in the winter. There's cool coastal birds. There's some specialties in the mountains and the coastal chaparral and stuff. But man, a big migratory pathway. I just certainly didn't think of the Southern California mountains as a big migratory pathway, and I don't think really any of us did necessarily. And that's probably the most important thing we learned at Bear Divide is that really big numbers of passerine birds are migrating along these mountains through and north of Los Angeles. Pardon me if you can hear the squeak toy in the background. That's my puppy puffing. So here's a little plot that I made. Here's a bunch of pictures I took of birds flying by at Bear Divide and when they came through in the year. So earlier in the season, beginning of April is on the left of the plot here. Later in the season, into June is on the right. And what you see is each bird has a different peak and spread of when they come through. So yellow-rumped warbler at the very top comes through the earliest, and yellow warbler at the very bottom comes through the latest. I made this plot a few years ago. We have a lot more data now, so this would be filled in a bit more, especially towards the later end into June. But the point is that every bird kind of has its own idiosyncratic migratory timing. A lot of birds line up, but not only do they have a different peak, but they have a different spread, right? Like yellow-rumped warbler, we get them from the beginning of when we're there all the way into mid-May. Yellow warbler, they're around for a couple months, but some birds like, Wilson's warbler or warbling vireo or Nashville warbler have, a pretty narrow peak. They have a certain peak when they all kind of come through. So one of the cool things we've learned just by standing up there monitoring birds is that every species has its own, its own time signature basically for migration. Another one of the cool things we've been able to do is ground truth radar observations. So a really new and exciting field in ornithology is called aeroecology, which is basically measuring organisms in the air. and we can measure birds in the air with radar. It's Doppler radar. It works the same way as weather radar. What the radar does is it, sends radar out, and if it hits something, which with weather it's like ice crystals, it bounces it back, but it also bounces birds back, and we can make estimates of how many birds are in the air at any one time. There's not been a lot of work to be able to ground truth this work, and so what we can do, all I'm showing here is I pulled radar data from some different nights when we had good days and bad days of birds at Bear Divide, and tried to say like how well did the birds on the radar show up at Bear Divide, and there's a pretty good correlation. We were able to find, if we saw birds at night on the radar, we also had birds at Bear Divide. And this radar I took was down in Orange County, so it was about 150 miles south, and the peak of birds came through around 2 or 3 in the morning on the radar, and those were birds that came around 6 or 7 in the morning at Bear Divide. So if they're the same birds, it took them about 3 or 4 hours to go that distance, which is another thing we're learning. So one of the questions we might ask is, why do different species come through at different times a year? And one of the answers, it doesn't explain everything, but part of it is breeding latitude. And so you imagine the farther south you live, the earlier spring comes. So if a bird breeds in San Diego, when I lived in Los Angeles, hooded orioles showed up in now basically first second week of March to start breeding. Whereas if you're a bird that lives in Alaska, like a yellow warbler that breeds in northern Alaska, there's ice until June almost basically. And so birds that breed farther north tend to migrate later, and we see that in the Bear Divide data. So here I just compared the passage date of species to the median breeding latitude, and you can see birds that tend to breed farther north tend to migrate later. And what's cool is actually going back, we're looking at the spread, right? These birds that are more spread out also have more spread out breeding distributions. So yellow warbler breeds from the Galapagos Islands all the way to the north slope of Alaska, north of the Arctic Circle or near the Arctic Circle, and they have a really spread out migration date because you get local breeders coming through at the very beginning of the season and all the way through to like birds that are on their way to Alaska at the end of the season. Pardon me. Whereas birds like hermit warbler or Cassin's vireo, they have a pretty narrow breeding range. They breed in hermit warbler breeds from Central California to Central Oregon, in the mid Cascades where it trades off with the Townsend's warbler, and that's about it. So the peak can be determined by breeding latitude, as can the spread. So each individual bird has its own, ideal migratory timing depending on the species it is and where it breeds, and that also affects our timing signature by species. We've had a couple cool, like fun goodies at Bear Divide. I've had summer tanager, blue grosbeak. We've now also had zone-tailed hawk, a couple cool rare birds. Pretty sure we had a yellow-throated vireo there one time. We've also had some cool local and interesting movements, especially finches. As some of you probably know, finches tend to be like eruptive birds, and some years there's a bunch, some years there's not. And we see the same thing at Bear Divide, where some years we've got tons of purple finches, some years not. Same with pine siskins. We had one year where we had tons of Cassin's finches, which is amazing because our first couple of years there, we'd never had a Cassin's finch. And I think the bird in the picture there is the first Cassin's finch I ever saw there. And I was like going crazy. I was super excited about it. And then we saw them every single day for the rest of the year. We saw like 4 or 5 a day and then none the next year. And so we're also learning about the eruptive year to year patterns of some of these finches by watching them migrate through, which is pretty cool. And man, Cassin's finch is not a bird you can get like in LA, like down in the city too. So a lot of birds that like just fly right over the city that are hard to see in the area, you can get good numbers of at Bear Divide. We've also found that there are, large movements of violet green swallows in late March, early April, really big movements, and to the extent that this might be like a really important corridor for this Western montane species. We've also been able to look at sex-based migration timing just through photographs. I try to take pictures of as many birds as I can, as you can probably see. And in birds that are easily sexable, like these Western tanagers, we see that the adult males move through first and then females and young birds, which fits with theory and fits with everything we know about, bird migration in species where males compete for females. The males show up first and set up territories, and The females come up later to assess the male's territories and decide which male to choose. Note that that is opposite in species where the females compete for males, but there aren't any passerines in our region where the females compete for males. There are some birds, there are some shorebirds, phalaropes do that, but in our passerine flyby, bear divide, it's all males competing for females, and so the males come through first, often for a couple weeks. Some of these birds, like western tanagers, we see adult males for 2, even 3 weeks before we start seeing the first females. It's really striking. We also sometimes get unexpected movements of water birds. As you saw on the map, bear divide's quite inland, but we'll get western sandpipers and dunlins and cumloons and cormorants and stuff. I think just cutting across, which is pretty fun. It's always very unexpected and very fun. Surprisingly low numbers of thrushes, though. We get quite a few thrushes. We get hermit and Swainson's thrushes. My guess is that they are more of a pure nocturnal migrant. The reason I say it's surprisingly low numbers is, if any of y'all have been out at night on a good migration day anywhere on the West Coast, you know that hearing migrants can be difficult. In the East, it's a lot easier to hear migrants. If you go out on a quiet night, on a good day in migration, you can hear the birds flying over and calling. And we actually know why that is. Recent research with radar shows that birds fly lower, a lot lower to the ground in the East than they do in the West. We aren't 100% sure why, but it's probably because of the mountains. In the East, it's nice and flat and they can fly nice and low. And in the West, there's mountains. And so they probably just keep some altitude so they don't have to keep going up and down over hills and mountains and stuff, which is pretty fascinating. But yeah, if you're ever out in the East, during migration, especially spring migration, you have a good quiet night, just go outside and listen. You can quite often hear lots of birds going over. Anyway, back to what I was saying, back from that tangent. If you're out in the West and you hear birds flying over, it's probably Swainson's thrushes. You can hear lots of Swainson's thrushes flying over at night in the West during migration. That's often the only species you can hear. So expected to see lots and lots of Swainson's thrushes, bear divide, but we don't. And I'm guessing it's because they are a little more truly nocturnal. They're really strong flyers. They have really big eyes, which means they like darkness. Birds that have big eyes don't really like to be in the light as much as birds that have little eyes. And so I'm guessing they kind of just stick more to that nocturnal schedule than other birds, but we're still not 100% sure. We also get lots and lots of Nashville warblers, which is another surprise. Nashville warbler is not a common bird in Los Angeles County. It's not like a rarity, but again, if you got for a day and you see 2 or 3, it's pretty cool. And, we'll get 500, 600, maybe 1,000 coming through in a season. And bear divide, it seems to be a really major corridor for them. We also get huge numbers of Wilson's warblers. I think this is probably maybe our most common species at bear divide. Again, to the extent that it might be a globally important flyway for these Western populations of Wilson's warblers. We get some raptors like this swing duck, but another surprise to me about bear divide is it doesn't really seem to be a raptor migration corridor. So maybe some of you, when I was talking about visible migration in the beginning, were thinking, oh, well, what about hawk watches? And I kind of mentioned hawk watches. Hawk watches are a bit of a different thing because, raptors do tend to migrate during the day. And there are some really cool spots where you can go and see really big concentrations of raptors. Pardon me. Elva, who introduced me, and I went down to Veracruz, was that a year ago? And we saw like a million broadwing hawks and Swainson's hawks and turkey vultures and stuff flying south at this really cool hawk watch. It was fantastic. And everybody comes up to bear divide and asks, what about the hawks? Is this a good hawk watch? And surprisingly, no, we get a few raptors, but we don't really get any concentrations. The only raptor that we get in concentrations there is Swainson's hawks, like this Swainson's hawk. And we'll get them in flocks sometimes flocks up to a couple hundred, which is pretty cool. But that happens like once a year and they all go by and that's about it, and then, maybe we'll get 1 or 2 sharp-shinned hawks or merlins. We had a zone-tailed hawk last year, which is a really good bird. But that's about it. So it's also kind of funny that whatever phenomenon is concentrating these passerines doesn't really seem to affect raptors, and it doesn't seem to be like a concentrated area for raptors. We've also had we've documented some cool hybrids and intergrades there, like this Audubon's myrtle warbler intergrade. Here's another one. Here's a hermit Townsend's warbler hybrid. It's got a head like a hermit warbler, but yellow below like a Townsend's. And then here is another hermit Townsend. So this has a hermit warbler head and a Townsend's warbler body, and then this bird has a Townsend's warbler head and a hermit warbler body. It's like they just swapped heads. Um, we've also had black-chin sparrows up there, which is a cool local breeder. It's a migrant that's rarely seen on migration. It's one of those birds that seems to just teleport between its winter range and its breeding range. You can see them on the breeding range, you see them on the wintering range, but gosh, you seem to never pick them up on migration, and we've gotten a few there. We've also had local movements of birds that are bigger than they were in, I might have expected, like band-tailed pigeons and acorn woodpeckers and others. Um, Band-tailed pigeons, I'll get back to. I think that the band-tailed pigeons we're seeing there are actual true migrants and not just local birds moving around. But acorn woodpeckers, man, I don't think there's any ornithologist that I know that really thinks acorn woodpeckers migrate. But geez, we get them coming through there going north. We've also had flocks of scrub jays, which is a famously sedentary bird. We had a flock of like 35 scrub jays fly north through Bear Divide a few years ago. So all sorts of weird mysteries. Once you start looking, anywhere you start looking, there's always weird stuff in this world, I guess. We also have tons of phainopeplas moving through, which is pretty cool. These are birds that breed locally, but we think they might be moving out to the desert to breed later in the year. I'll get back to this also. Phainopepla is a really fantastic bird. We've also found that birds differ in the time of day that they migrate through Bear Divide. So larger flycatchers, so like this ash-throated flycatcher and hummingbirds especially, tend to move through a little bit later in the morning than things like orioles and tanagers and cardinalids. So that may be how strong the flyer they are. It might be wind. It might be what they eat. It might be because the hummingbirds and flycatchers are, stopping to eat food a little bit more along the way. We're still not sure. I just wanted to show you a little bit where these birds are coming from. We have birds like Swainson's thrush that are mostly coming from all the way down in the Andes. So this is where they live in the winter. Um, and here's their migration map. So they're coming north into US now, up into the breeding range, and then back down. And you can see if you kind of watch through the California area, they all sort of funnel up and along the coast and then go up. Oh, I'll show you that one more time. So a lot of them mostly from the Andes up through Mexico, funnel up through Bear Divide, and then they go up to breed in the Pacific Northwest, which is pretty cool. So there's a few species like this, not eastern woodpecker, western woodpecker, and then olive-side flycatcher also come from the Andes as far south as northwest Argentina. The Swainson's hawk, which I just showed, comes from the Chaco region of Argentina and Paraguay and Bolivia and Brazil. So really, coming from really far away. Most of the species of birds that we get at Bear Divide winter in Mexico and Central America, like this fox's swift. I'll show you, this is where they winter. Ignore the birds on the Yucatan. That's a resident population that might be a separate species. You can see them in the winter here, and then they filter up through the west, right through Bear Divide, breed in the Pacific Northwest, and then on the way back down, right through Ashland, where they get in our chimneys in flocks of hundreds or even thousands, and sometimes die if somebody puts their fire on when there's a bunch of swifts in their chimney. And then they go back down. And we actually get really big numbers of oxus swifts at Bear Divide. It's really cool. We've also had now recently quite a few black swifts and a few handfuls of chimney swifts at Bear Divide. Warbling deer is another example. A lot of these birds are from western and central and southern Mexico. I also just like looking at these migration maps. It's pretty cool. Winter, spring, summer, and then back down to fall and winter. Some of these birds are just moving throughout the western U.S., like Lawrence's goldfinches. They're not really a migrant. They're almost endemic to California, and they just sort of move around through the year. And they don't have much of a pattern to it. And so I expected that, we would get a few up there. We'd see a few here and there, because that's how Lawrence's goldfinches are. You just see a few here and there. But I was totally wrong. I was flabbergasted when I got up there to, see hundreds of them migrating north in flocks. Like they're all going the same direction. There's big numbers of them. So there's something going on with movements of Lawrence's goldfinches that we still don't know about, because I think they might be the most common migrant finch that we have at Bear Divide, which again was really surprising to me, given again, this is Look at how they migrate. I don't know, they just sort of move around a bit. So we got a lot to learn with them. I was talking earlier about fan and what they do, why we have so many coming through Bear Divide. Also, a bird that doesn't go too far north of where we are. If you live in Oregon, you know that Anapeplas don't live in Oregon. There's only a couple of records. Um, this was a paper, this is a study done a few years ago now, 6 years ago now, by Dan Baldessari, where he put GPS tags on Phainopeplas. And he found that these birds that had bred in oak chaparral on the coast in California, they went up and across the mountains and then they went over to the desert to breed again, sometimes as far as Chihuahua, Mexico. And I'm guessing that's what these birds are doing. The reason they go over there and breed again is that after our breeding season, which is in the summer, it gets really dry, but that's the wettest time of year in Northwest Mexico because it's the monsoon season. And so they're taking advantage of basically two breeding seasons. They breed here during the breeding season, and then they get out and go to Mexico for the monsoons to breed again, which is pretty cool. And that lines up with when we see phainopeplas at Bear Divide, which is later than most birds. It's mid, late May, even into June. We'll get good numbers of phainopeplas well into June. The monsoon really doesn't pick up in force until late June, July, August. And it's actually getting later with climate changes, moving into more into like September, October. And so I don't know, maybe if we stayed through June, we'd still get phainopeplas, but they migrate later than most birds. And I'm guessing this is why they're probably doing this. I mentioned band-tailed pigeons. Um, this may not be news to any of y'all in Oregon, but where I grew up in Central California, we think of band-tailed pigeon as a resident bird because they're really common throughout the year. But if you look at this map, you look at Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and there's no band-tailed pigeons. This is the middle of the winter. And as we show this migratory map, here they come. They come and they breed west of the Cascades all the way up through the northern tip of Vancouver Island and then back down. We get really big numbers of band-tailed pigeons coming through Bear Divide. So, I don't really know, but my guess is that, in a lot of species where you have a resident population and a migratory population, the migratory population tends to leapfrog the resident population, which is it'll winter farther south and breed farther north. So, like white-crowned sparrows, there's the resident nuttall-eye on the coast in California, and then you have the Puget Sound birds, which breed north of the nuttals, and then they winter south of the nuttals. And that's a really common pattern in species where you have both migrant and resident populations. They'll leapfrog each other. And my guess is that that's what the band-tailed pigeons are doing. The ones that breed in Oregon, Washington, and Vancouver are leapfrogging most of the residents, probably because of competition. The residents already have all the acorns on lockdown, and they're going a little bit farther south. And that's why we see them all the way down Los Angeles on their way back north. Do I know that for sure? No. I would love to put some GPS tags on them and find out someday. But it's pretty cool. And again, it was a big surprise to me to see so many band-tailed pigeons. Another cool and weird little thing about band-tailed pigeons is, as you can see in this picture, we really often see them migrating at Bear Divide with their bill open, like you see this bird here. Not a lot of birds fly with their bills open, and band-tailed pigeons do. I have a guess at that. My guess is it's thermoregulatory. They're big birds, and the bigger an animal it is, the harder it is to get rid of heat. Birds mostly get rid of heat through their feet and their bills, and band-tailed pigeons have tiny little feet and tiny little bills. And so my guess is that they're kind of panting. They're dumping heat a little bit while they fly, but I don't really know that. But what I do know is we see a lot of band-tailed pigeons flying with their bill open, which is weird. I mean, how often do you see birds flying with their bills open? Another big surprise to see migrating there was Cassin's kingbird. Again, if you're from Southern California, you think as Cassin's kingbird is a resident endemic to Trader Joe's parking lots. And when we went to Bear Divide, we saw flocks of them flying north. And I want to bring your attention to this map. This is Cassin's kingbirds in the middle of the winter. You can see those birds in Southern California, those residents, they're there all year. And you can see birds spending the winter in central Mexico through northwest Mexico, and also pay special attention to the birds in Baja California, especially all those birds in Baja California Sur, and watch what they do. So they kind of retract and then they go north and they disappear. They kind of pulse through LA, and then the breeding season they breed in highland pinyon juniper in the southern Great Basin, and now they're back down. I'll show you that again. So here they kind of disappear up through and then across. And so my guess is they go, at least some of these birds, they go north, they follow the coast, and then by the time they're in LA, they're stuck on the wrong side of the mountains and they have to get over the mountains just like everybody else. So instead of filtering through the mountains to go north, they do what Phainopeplas do is they filter through the mountains to then turn and go east to breed where they breed over there. So that's my guess, which is pretty cool because again, we knew that there was a migratory population of Caslin's kingbirds, this eastern population, but I don't think we knew that we got those birds in California. We don't think of Caslin's kingbird as a migratory bird on the west coast. It's really just migratory inland, but we do seem to get these migrant Caslin's kingbirds, which is pretty cool. When do birds migrate bear divide? I already went over that. Sorry, that slide is out of place. But what you can learn about when birds migrate at bear divide, there's this cool website called birdcast.org that gives a bird migration forecast. I don't know if you all have seen this. It uses radar imagery and past relationships between radar imagery and date and weather to give you a forecast of how many birds are going to migrate through your area at night. So we can use this to kind of like predict when a good day at bear divide is and isn't. And this ties into the radar stuff I was talking about earlier, correlating this with what we do and don't see. If you're ever considering going to bear divide or going to any other migration hotspot, I recommend using this tool. And I want to show you really quickly how it works. I talked about birds being able to be seen on the radar. This is radar. This is late afternoon on May 4th, 2021. This is the next rad radar for the whole US. And you could see, pardon me, there's some weather. There's some southern thunderstorms, what you get in the afternoon in the south in the summer, which show up as bright green. And what you're going to see is these radar. What it does is it's a cone. So by the time you get up to where the clouds are, the cone kind of covers everything. But anything that's lower shows up as these donuts because the cone doesn't cover everything. And so what you'll see is as dusk goes across the US from east to west, birds lifting up, looking like fuzz around little cones. So here goes dusk from east to west. You see, boom, the US just blows up with birds. And now dawn comes and they all put down. So again, that's what I was talking about. These birds flying high up in the atmosphere at night. You can see it on radar. So here we are in the middle of the night where it froze or 10:41 p.m. Central Time. All these birds migrating through the east and quite a few birds migrating in the west. And particularly if you look right at Los Angeles right now, what you can see is tons and tons of birds over the LA basin and no birds north of the San Gabriel Mountains. And so this is where I got the idea that the birds weren't going up and over the mountains, they're hitting the mountains and turning and flying along the mountains. Because when you look at the radar, you can see them doing that. You can see the mountains funneling the birds. I'll show that again. And you can look wherever you want, but pay special attention to the LA area if you want. They all get there and then they kind of burst over like a dam right in that area. Which is pretty cool. And so it does kind of lend credence to this idea of the mountains acting as sort of a funnel for birds. So we've been counting birds up there. This guy here is Devin Cameron Burke. We've had different counters up there on different years. And as you might imagine, it's hard to count 14 or 20,000 birds as they go by. We set up this cool system using the software called Dunkadoo, which is actually now they went out of business, and so we had to switch to different software. But the cool thing is we made buttons just for each species. So instead of like having to have different clickers, it's basically like a digital set of clickers. So if Nashville Warbler flies by, he just hits the Nashville Warbler button and it's good. And or if 10 fly by, he hits Nashville Warbler 10 and it's good. And the direction it flies by. And so you can really, keep up with stuff as it goes, which is amazing because again, you can imagine it can be a lot. And we've set up this website called the Bear Divide, beardivide.org. I think it's still up. And you can actually watch live sightings. So this is a screen grab I took while we were taking data a few years ago. And you could just literally watch the live data come in. So on days when I'm stuck at work and the bear divide count is going, which it goes most weekdays, I like to just sit and be like, okay, what's going on? All right, there's 80 cowbirds, 1 Costa hummingbird, 7 yellow-rumped warblers, barn swallow, 6 yellow. And this is how fast, like this was live. This is how fast it happens. Stuff is just going. So that's pretty fun. You can also summarize the data in all sorts of different ways. You can get these live updates, total species count for the day, total count for the day, stuff like that every day. We put out these because we're, entering the data as it comes in and that we're connected to the internet. The data are going out live as we take them, which is pretty fun. Some other ways to summarize them, by date and by species composition, stuff like that. Um, Another cool thing about Bear Divide is it's started to really attract people, which is great. A lot of other birding sites or places that are really important for birds, we sometimes try to keep the human footprint low, but Bear Divide, the birds are just kind of flying right over. We've had days where that whole, this whole road that you can see is lined with people, and the birds are just whipping right by. They're not using the habitat, and so we don't seem to be necessarily disturbing them. So one of the cool things about Bear Divide is it's a place you can bring people and have them really appreciate birds, and it's fun for a lot of reasons. It's appealing. I have found that it's appealing to just about everybody. It can be appealing to the most advanced hardcore birder because we get cool rarities there. We get lots of looks at birds that are often pretty uncommon, like black swift and stuff like that. Um, and it's appealing all the way down to the beginner because it's really easy to see lots of birds. I'm sure some of you who are bird watchers have taken people out and tried to teach kids how to bird. Pardon me. You get binoculars. It's like, oh, it's up in this tree up there, and like, where is it? Oh, it flew. I didn't see it. Whatever. Bear Divide, you're just like standing in a river of birds, and they're just like, dude, they're just like whipping by you. It can be hard to get a good enough look to identify what they were sometimes, but it's pretty special. And so we brought university classes up there. We brought high school classes. Here's a Bullock's Oriole, going over the crowd of people. So it's pretty fun. I've also started to record flight calls up there. These pasturing birds, they make different calls when they're migrating than during the day. And so it can be hard. Like, I told you about, I encouraged y'all, to go out at night sometimes and listen for birds. And it can be hard to know what call is what bird because they make different bird calls at night during the day. And in the East, we figured out a lot of these calls at places like Cape May, recording birds and then watching them go by. And in the West, we mostly know the flight calls, but we don't really have good sample sizes. Like we haven't been able to train automated call detectors on Western birds like we have on the East. And so I've spent a bit of time out there just recording birds as they fly over because I can see them. And so a bird will fly by calling and I'll be like, that was a Wilson's warbler, that was a yellow warbler, whatever. So here's a spectrogram of a Wilson's warbler. I recorded as it flew by, giving its migratory flight call. Um, We've also Folks have also started banning birds there. I haven't been as directly involved in this, although I've been working alongside them and highly support them. And they're all wonderful people. So they've been setting up nets and catching birds, which is pretty cool. So we do the count, we count the birds, we see like what species are coming by and what numbers, and then the bird banders catch some of these birds. Of course, they don't catch the thousands of birds on purpose because they can't process that many birds. They'll catch 40 or 50 birds in a day. But the cool thing is they can take detailed measurements. They can look at the fat. They can get the physiology. They can get the body condition of these birds. A lot more data than we can get at the count, which is really cool. So these folks, so Lauren Hill is one of them. They've, in their first year, they caught over 1,000 birds, over 40 species. Their problem isn't catching birds, it's catching too many birds. They often have to close nets so they don't catch too many birds. And they have a really great volunteer program down there. So another cool thing is, you can be standing at the divide and have all these birds coming by and it's hard to look at them. And then you just walk over to the banding table and, they're really friendly and they'll usually show you, a little bird like this stunning Western tanager right in the hand. You can get a great look at it. Here's another bird that they banded was this gray vireo. This is another bird just like black-chinned sparrow that, like I was saying, teleports seemingly from its wintering ground to its breeding ground. It's a bird you can find on the breeding ground. They're kind of rare and kind of tough on the breeding ground. They're even rarer and tougher in the winter, but they are just about unheard of as a migrant. There's not many people alive who have seen a migrant gray vireo besides the people who were at Bear Divide the day we caught this one, which is really, really cool. We also This is another cool story. These Bell's sparrows, there are a couple subspecies of Bell's sparrows. The local breeding subspecies, which is belli, which is the coastal chaparral species, which breeds right at Bear Divide. If we didn't have a banding station up, I would have assumed all the bell sparrows we caught were belli, but or all the birds that we got there were belli, the local breeders. But when they caught them and measured them, we realized that these birds were canescens, which are the birds that breed out in the desert and are migratory. So another case of just like band-tailed pigeon or phainopepla or whatever, we've got migrant and resident birds. And, if we weren't at Bear Divide, we wouldn't know. We would think we were only seeing the residents if we didn't take a more detailed look. And in this case, if we didn't catch them and measure them, we would think we were only seeing the residents. So another case of, the closer you look, the more there is. And so we still have a whole lot to learn. We've hit the tip of the iceberg. It's a phenomenal place. It's really unique, and so there is just still so much to learn. We're trying to keep the count going. We have some folks counting and banding this year. We're always trying to raise money for it. We're always trying to get folks interested. It's just a phenomenal place, and really unique and really spectacular. It's one of my favorite places in the world. So check out the website, come visit. Feel free to donate money or gear to the counters or the banders. And if y'all are interested in the KBO field trip, Elva has more information on that. And with that, I'll take any questions that any of y'all have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I threw in the chat our link for the KBO trip up to Bear Divide in April. But I'm just going to give everyone a second if you have any questions for Ryan about his presentation.
I'm muted.
Yeah.
I will say we had a super fun trip last year. Amanda, who I see, hi Amanda, was there, and we had a fantastic time. It's a little weather dependent. Bear Divide tends to have the most birds on clear sunny days. But in peak migration season, which is kind of April 20th through May 20th, most days have birds, and we only really get skunked when it's like completely fogged in. And then of course last year we had like two mornings that were completely fogged in, which is pretty rare that time of year. But we got some movement the second day, and then we had one really fun morning. So we expect that time of year every day to be good, but it is a little weather dependent. But we had a super fun trip last year that I think everybody was happy about. And in fact, Jared, if any of you have read Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond was around, hanging around looking at birds. That was it during that trip? Maybe it was the year before. Anyway, that was the year before, but he was there.
Yeah, since Amanda is also one of our board members. She's our vice president. Amanda, would you like to talk about your experience going on the trip?
Yeah, I fully endorse it. It was super fun. And I think the way we've planned it this year is to give, I mean, like we did last year, but having several mornings there is a good idea because you get a different feel each day of what's going on, depending on weather. And I had a blast at Bear Divide, but it's not just about how many birds are flying by you, which is pretty cool, but the banding station was amazing. And they were just churning through birds. And the people who were working the banding station were really um, personable and warm, and they were making a whole uh, it was part of their mission to show the people who were there what they were doing, and they just really encouraged interest from all the people, and they were showing birds, and I mean just being able to see birds up close like that is really really cool. And then there's also several other really cool areas to bird around Bear Divide. At sort of on the ride up there, you pass through a couple of really great habitats, and we spent uh, afternoons and even some little breaks in the morning going back to the parks that were nearby to see birds there. And for me, I saw a few birds that I hadn't seen before because it's just a different habitat and stuff than here. So I think Bear Divide is the big um sell, or like it's obviously the novel sort of cool thing to go see. But this trip has a lot of other stuff that's actually really cool too. I mean, we made the most of our trip there last year and really saw a lot of cool stuff. Not just Bear Divide, which is also very cool.
Certainly did. Yeah. Yeah, we did a couple fun side trips for local breeders. We also did a side trip to the parrot roost, which was pretty fun.
Totally
Um,
cool.
couple we had a couple questions. One question from Keith: is there any concern about need for protecting the divide? Um, yes, it is. It is right alongside Angeles National Forest, and it is, I think, now part of Angeles National Forest, which is nice. Um, that said, who knows what's going to happen with public lands and national forests anytime soon. Um, yes, I think so. The birds are flying over. A lot of the birds do stop and forage in the chaparral there. And I think that chaparral, and especially like the riparian corridors north of there, are probably really important. I think, you know, it burns there pretty regularly, and that's okay. I think one of the worst things that could happen is if it got developed. If there were a bunch of buildings and glass there. Man, if there was one building with like a bunch of glass there right at Bear Divide, it'd kill like a million birds a year. That'd be a disaster. So luckily it's within the national forest, and so we think we're okay for now, but we're continuing to talk with the local land managers and stuff. We've been trying to sort of get the Angeles National Forest's attention about this. We've had two articles now come out in the LA Times about Bear Divide, and that's really drummed up attention. So, one of the things I was talking about, when you find a spot that's really important for birds, it's, you question how much attention you want to bring to it. But Bear Divide is not as sensitive to disturbance. So we have been trying to bring attention to it because we want people to be aware and to be able to continue to conserve it because it's not as much of a concern for disturbance. There's a question by Janet. Is there camping nearby? Yes. Um, I believe, yes. So I have camped when I took my ornithology class there a couple years ago, and I was teaching at Cal State Stanislaus. I took my ornithology class, and we camped in a campground of an RV park nearby. It wasn't the world's most beautiful campground, but it was right on the Santa Clarita River. It was actually the campsite itself was really nice, but it was right next to like 50 RVs. But there are a couple other campgrounds nearby. There's one much closer. The reason we didn't use it that year is there had been a bunch of flooding and it had flooded out. But this was like 3 years ago, so it might be built back up. So I would take a look. There are different scattered campgrounds in the Angeles National Forest. But if you're considering going and considering camping, just make sure that you check like with Google Maps or something how far the drive is because something might look close, but it's like you have to go all the way down to Pasadena and then back up to get there because that's kind of how it is in those mountains sometimes. So just you check the drive time if you're looking at campsites.
Yeah, hi. My name's Scott English, and I have a question for you, Ryan, if there's time.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, my question is, it sounds like the Bear Divide was a recently discovered phenomena as far as place where you could see these marvelous birds. So my question is, how many other Bear Divides could there be out there? I mean, how unusual would it be to find, several more or a number more of these wonderful places where you can observe so many birds?
It's a fantastic question. I'm sure there are some. Um, There is a spot north of there where this guy Richard Crosley. Some of you may have his field guides. It's the field guides that are like the photo montage style field guides. He has been spending time in Gorman, which is kind of just north of Bear Divide, and has been having good movements of birds. Never quite as concentrated in one reliable spot as Bear Divide, and I think that's probably kind of a theme. And people have seen movements of birds other places in San Gabriel's, where it's like you might just get really lucky on a day and have quite a few birds moving over. The really unique thing about Bear Divide is it's like one specific spot. It's this really narrow pass, so all the birds funnel through. That's like the same spot and it's reliable, and the birds down low and close. So a lot of other spots, you might get good numbers of birds, but they might be pretty high up, or they might move around and be unreliable. So there might be some other spots like that. I'm guessing part of what makes Bear Divide so rare is the reliability and how low the birds are. But the one thing that Bear Divide shares with Butterbret is they are, north-south canyons in an east-west mountain range. And I think if you're to look for other spots like Bear Divide, that's what you would want, is like an east-west mountain range that you have lots of birds migrating south of. They hit that mountain range, and then you want to look for like where they're going to funnel through there. And in fact, I've spent some time, right here on Siskiyou Pass, where Highway 5 comes through the Siskiyous just south of Ashland, because that's kind of a similar setup. And I've been skunked every time. So I think it might be a little too high, or maybe we don't have the numbers, or maybe I just haven't been the right days. I kind of had hope. I was looking at the maps before I moved here, sort of, having high hopes about finding another Bear Divide. And so far I've seen pretty good numbers of greater white-fronted geese and a handful of turkey vultures, and that's about it.
Well, sounds like that'd be a great adventure to go searching for a place like that or two.
Sure would be.
Does anyone have any questions about the trip?
Well, oh, yep.
I have one. If we're making our arrangements, can we fly back on Saturday evening, or is it, yes, Elvis going.
Yeah, so that's what we did last time, because we get up to Bear Divide pretty early. So we load up in our van around 5 a.m., swing by Starbucks, get our coffee and breakfast, and head up the mountain and set up a nice little table and get our binoculars out. And so we're probably up in the mountains around 5:30. And so we're done. I feel like we were done a little before noon each day. And so we definitely gave some time on Saturday if people wanted to get back a little earlier flight. Yeah. So I know last time I think we all flew out on Saturday afternoon, except for people that drove.
Yeah. The birds taper off 10:30 or so. We're kind of definitely out of there by noon or something. So Saturday night is fine. And I'll mention, if anybody needs to, fly in early or late, or stay early or arrive early or whatever, or stay late, the airport's really close. It's all really convenient. Burbank Airport is small and easy and very close.
Way better than flying in and out of LA. Highly recommend going to the Burbank Airport, even if you go on your own.
Yes. Much, much, much better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody. I'll let you all get back to your martinis. Really appreciate you all coming. And if you have any more questions, feel free to email Elva.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Elva, how much room is there?
How much room is there?
Yeah, left.
Yeah, so we still have 8 spots left.
Okay, so I can recruit a couple friends.
Yes, we highly recommend bringing friends. That's what Amanda did. Amanda actually brought her parents down and had a great time. And we also had someone that brought, I believe, her daughter with her. It was in high school, and took her out of class. And it was really nice having a youngster around and getting to hear experience birding in such a big place for the first time. It was really unique.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.